You're listening to Stellar Success, Leveling Up for Medical Pros with Dr. Tudor Francu. Join us as we explore how medical professionals can achieve stellar success in all areas of life. It's time to level up.
Hi, everyone. We're back at Stellar Success Podcast. I'm Dr. Tudor Francu, and I have a great guest today, Dr. Matthew Bernstein. How are you, Doc?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
Very good, very good. Nice to have you over on our podcast. And I want to start with a very simple question, but probably a long answer. Okay. How do you see your success? What is success for you, and why do you do what you do?
Well, it's a good question. It's actually not that easy to answer. Yeah. I think for me, success is making a difference in my patients' lives, really. That's how I measure success day to day and week to week and year to year is, can I make a difference in the people that I'm working with? That's why I do it. That's why I decided to do it in the first place. And that's still sort of how I measure it, I think. Yeah.
Very nice. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great goal to have. We generally, as physicians in general, we have the notion that, we need to focus on our patients all the time.
Yeah.
But we tend to see that only through the spectrum of our specialty. And you are someone who kind of branched out of your specialty, psychiatry, and did something very interesting that I think a lot of people will be happy to know about and learn more from you. The concept of metabolic psychiatry. Can you explain that to us?
Sure. Yeah, and it is pretty new. So I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of your listeners haven't heard of this as of yet. But I think in the next 3 to 5 years, a lot more people will know about it. So it's this idea that metabolism and metabolic health is highly correlated with mental health. And that if we're not metabolically healthy, it's almost impossible for our brain to function the way it's supposed to. And it goes even deeper than sort of that superficial connection between those things, but really even severe mental illness really have a metabolic origin and a metabolic potential solution as well. And so, this goes back to about 100 years ago at the Mayo Clinic when they started using ketogenic diets to treat kids with treatment-resistant epilepsy. And they had really amazing success doing so. It was, a very successful and widely used treatment for many decades. And, it became less in favor when we started having more medications to prescribe. But it turns out that it's still way more effective than medications in many cases with kids with epilepsy, especially certain forms of epilepsy. And it's now been validated in prospective randomized trials. I think there's about 13 of them. It's part of the standard of care in multiple Cochrane reviews in epilepsy. And we've now started applying this in mental health and psychiatry, similarly to the way that we use a lot of epilepsy medications in psychiatry. Things like Depakote and Lamictal and Tegretol are very frequently used in my practice. So it's really an off-label use of an epilepsy treatment for mental health. And so, when I first found out about this, it was probably about 6 or 7 years ago, I was at a grand rounds and learned about this. And I was really blown away by the possibility of this happening. I heard a case report of a woman who had schizophrenia on clozapine, which is really the strongest antipsychotic we have, and still was treatment resistant over the course of 50 years and been hospitalized 100 times. And this woman was put on a ketogenic diet for weight loss. And within a few months, her psychosis started dissolving. And within a year was off of all of her psychiatric medications and free of psychosis, which had never happened on medications. And she went on to live another 10 or 12 years after that without any psychosis, never needing medications again. And this stuff just doesn't happen. And in fact, if I didn't know the person presenting that case, I may not have believed it. I probably wouldn't have believed it. I think a lot of people in the audience probably didn't believe it. But I knew him, and I knew that he was a straight shooter and that this was, a real thing. So that really got me interested and started doing a lot of my own research, trying to figure out, how does this work? Why does this work? And then really the challenge is, how do you institute this in people who already have a mental health condition? Because it's not necessarily an easy diet to follow. So that's really the trick in many ways, is how are we going to get people to actually do it?
Yeah, this is very interesting because recently I think there are a lot of studies that prove that a lot of the mediators and chemical compounds that are involved in mental health disorders are actually secreted in the gut. And the way you eat and the diet you follow is going to, obviously determine what kind of mediators you secrete in your own body. But also, it's interesting to know that sometimes medication in your specialty in psychiatry are all the medications that you use are not necessarily very targeted to certain diseases, mental diseases. And then you find out that this kind of approach, regulating your metabolic pathways, would actually target very specific mediators for very specific diseases. Can you give us an example of what kind of discoveries were made following this treatments?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right to say that psychiatric medications are fairly nonspecific, and also I would say quite downstream from where the real pathology is occurring. We have medications that target neurotransmitters, and we know that they can be effective at reducing some symptoms, but they rarely truly reverse the disease process or even get people back to their pre-morbid level of functioning. And they have lots of side effects. And so, these are all hallmarks of a treatment that's not really targeting where the disease process is happening, but something downstream. With ketogenic diets, there's actually many mechanisms that have been identified because we've known about this in epilepsy for many decades, and neuroscientists have been trying to figure out, well, how do ketones, do this with epilepsy? And they've come up with lots of mechanisms by which ketones affect brain health. You already mentioned one, which is working on the microbiome gut-brain axis. But there's other mechanisms as well. I mean, some of the highlights are, ketones are an alternative source of fuel in the brain. And what happens is that people, their brain becomes insulin resistant. And so the brain can be literally bathed in glucose and still starving for energy because it requires insulin to bring the glucose into neurons. And this is this process called cerebral glucose hypometabolism, which has been mostly identified in epilepsy, but also in Alzheimer's disease. But we think it's one of the likely mechanisms in these mental health disorders as well. And then the other really important mechanism is ketones are a signaling molecule to tell mitochondria to multiply, to tell the cells to dismantle old non-functioning mitochondria and make new ones. And so it's this process called mitophagy that is induced by ketones. And that turns out to be incredibly important in terms of energy production, which we know mitochondria are highly involved in. And the brain is a very energy-intensive organ, obviously. But in addition, mitochondria do a lot of other things in the brain. They cause the release of neurotransmitters. They're involved in the transcription of certain genes in the nucleus. They're involved in the process of making hormones and release of hormones. So mitochondria are doing a lot more than just creating energy, and we're creating a lot more healthy mitochondria with a ketogenic diet. And then there's a number of other mechanisms as well. I mean, we can go through all of them if you'd like, but those are just some of the highlights, to sort of get us started with what we know the ketogenic diet does. And it is interesting in that it does seem to work in multiple different mental health disorders. It seems like whenever it's been studied, or again, these are so far a small case series. We don't have randomized controlled trials yet, but they're in the process of happening right now. But whenever we see it studied in things like depression, yes, it seems to work. Bipolar, yes. Schizophrenia, yes. OCD, we even have case reports. Autism, case reports and case series. Alzheimer's disease. So it seems to have this universal palliative, salutary benefit in the brain, which, is interesting. We also know that our diagnostic system in psychiatry is probably, not very correlated with what's really going on biologically. So it's not surprising to someone like me who is toiling in this diagnostic system to think that there could be one treatment that might work in many of these different conditions, I mean, especially given if all of them have an underlying metabolic, pathology.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. So let's go back to your personal professional career. So how did you end up doing what you're doing right now? What was your moment that you figure out this is a great field to be in?
Yeah. Well, I had been a psychiatrist, pretty, standard type of psychiatrist for many years prior to this. I had worked at McLean Hospital, which is a old freestanding psychiatric hospital, part of the Harvard system. I worked on an inpatient unit there. I did a lot of teaching. I had since moved to this other program called Ellenhorn, which is a psychosocial rehabilitation program. And that really opened my eyes up to a more sort of holistic way of thinking about treatment. Had my own personal experiences where some family members had some difficult to cure illnesses that made me realize that, allopathic medicine may not have all the answers all of the time. And we sometimes need to go digging further. And then like I said, I heard this lecture about these ketogenic diets. The moment for me, was figuring out that it wasn't necessary to do the full version of the ketogenic diet with every person and still get benefits. That was sort of what held me up at first was, well, this is a really powerful treatment. I actually did the ketogenic diet myself and felt a lot of benefits, but I also figured out that it was actually fairly challenging to do for myself, let alone I'm thinking, some of my patients, how are they going to do this? How are they going to institute this in their lives? But when I started doing more research and really understanding the underlying biology, I realized that there may be some less intensive versions, there may be some shortcuts, there may be some ways to get people on the pathway and then starting to feel better. And then the motivation will come and they will likely want to keep going further. And so that was really the moment for me when I realized I can start doing this with my patients. Doing approaches like some intermittent fasting with some MCT oil is one approach, or just eliminating sugar and processed foods and simple carbohydrates with some fasting and some exercise, whatever I could get them willing to do that would have some bang for the buck, we could start doing, improving their metabolism. And when they started feeling better, they would come back and say, well, this is amazing. I haven't felt well like this in a while. And then that would be the opening to say, well, we can get you feeling even better. Let's keep going down this pathway. And so I got a lot of people to engaged in that process that way.
I would imagine that someone who is on a long-term medication for a mental disorder experiences a lot of side effects from that kind of treatment. And once you expose them to a ketogenic diet that has multiple benefits on the body, not only mentally, but physically, hormonally, all those benefits could easily swing them over to this kind of treatment, I would imagine, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and I say all the time that, my purpose is working on someone's brain health and mental health, but I very much recognize that their goal might be, I just want to lose the weight that I put on from this medication. If we can just do something to help me lose weight, I'll be happy, Dr. Bernstein. And I say, okay, well, I've got a different idea about what this is going to do for you. I'm happy if you lose weight, but I see that more as a side effect, side effect. I have a different idea in mind, and they say, sure. I'm sure my mood will get better. Great. They don't really believe me, but then, I think we both end up becoming pleased and happy in the end when we start doing it because we kind of both get what we want. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So going back to your own success, do you think you have certain skills or habits that contributed to your present success professionally?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think I'm open-minded. I'm a pretty flexible thinker. I'm willing to see things in different perspectives, try to see the different perspectives of things. I think that's really part of being a clinical psychiatrist in many ways, that we can't just see things one way, so it's part of my personality, but I think part of my training too. And I'm hardworking. So, when I, got interested in this, I realized I had a lot to learn. I had to go back and learn a lot of the metabolic pathways and my cellular biology. And all of a sudden I'm thinking about all these lab tests that I've never ordered in my professional career, and I'm going to start ordering them. And so there was a ton to learn. But it was really, to me, it was something I was really passionate about. I knew it was going to be helpful for people. And so, I was pretty driven to, do all that research and do all that learning, alongside, the rest of my job that I was doing.
I think this is essential for someone to be open-minded and kind of take some risks in their career, because this is how discoveries are made. And, results on patients are much greater, I would say, if you try something else than everybody else does. But I'm sure your success in this field was based also on some failures, some setbacks, some things that didn't work well. Can you give us an example of some of those things that didn't necessarily work out for you and kind of pushed you forward?
Yeah, I think so. When I first started doing this, I initially started doing it in my private practice with people who I knew well. But I was pretty enthusiastic about it, and I started talking about it in the company where I work at Ellenhorn and trying to institute it there. And I started talking about it with new patients who were coming in. And I think I was probably a little over enthusiastic in certain circumstances and coming on a little too strong. I felt like I had figured something out that was really helpful and important. And some people would look at me and say, oh no, I don't want to do that. I have no interest. And, sometimes I would keep pushing, even when they were pretty clear. Oh, no, that's not for me. I don't want to do that. So I do think that I learned from that yes, it may be really exciting and I'm very excited about it. And I see the possibility for this person, but if they don't see the possibility and they're not interested, that's, I need to accept that. That's the end of the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's an informed consent after all, correct?
Absolutely. That's right.
Like in any specialty.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. I want to step back a little bit from your career and look at your personal success as a person, as a physician. What do you think it's something that brings you out of your comfort zone? Something that you do on purpose to explore some risks?
Yeah, that's also an excellent question. I've always been interested in sports. I used to play sports when I was a kid, and at some point, I was a pretty competitive squash player, and I sort of let that go for a while. But then at some point, maybe about 12 or 14 years ago, I decided I really wanted to be competing as in sports again, and it's not necessarily that comfortable for me. I get a little anxious sometimes in competition. And I know that, especially in a game like that, if you're anxious, you tighten up and you don't play well. And so every time I go out, I have to sort of fight my own sort of demons about, anxiety and performance and all of those things. But I think it's a really good thing for me to do because it's sort of almost like a moving meditation. You have to, be calm and moving at the same time. And I think, when I'm able to do it well, I feel like I'm really growing in some way. But it's a challenge. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Also, you tell your patients what to do, right? In this kind of specialty, I would say the metabolic psychiatry. But how do you structure your life? How do you look at nutrition, exercise, fitness?
Yeah. Well, I really practice what I preach at this point, which is I think a good place to be as a physician. I started. Like I said, I tried the ketogenic diet. I found it hard. But when I started coming back to it and doing the research, the way I got into it as well, as I was saying I do with my patients, I started doing a more subtle version and then eventually got deeper into it. And now I sort of found my sweet spot where I'm not in a deep level of ketosis, but I eat that way enough that I make, a moderate level of ketones. But I also am very interested in circadian rhythms. I get up every morning and go out and see the sun with my dog and my wife. And I exercise regularly. Like I said, I play squash, but I also, big believer in strength training and high intensity interval training. So I do those things. I also, big believer in the power of meditation and mindfulness. So I really, practice that as well, which probably another one that's one that I need to push myself and force myself sometimes. But I find that when I do, I'm doing much better. So yeah, I think all of those things, contribute to my own health, and the healthier I show up, the better I can do my job for multiple reasons. The one is that, it's easier to say this works when I can say, yeah, like I know for sure that it works. I've seen it work in myself. I know how it works and I know for sure that it can work. But I also can talk about the challenges sometimes. It's not always easy to do these things day in and day out. So, I think having those experiences to be able to share and talk about is, it's really important. And it's not typically part of psychiatry. Usually when I'm sitting around prescribing a medication, I don't say, well, yeah, this medication worked for me, so it'll work for you. That's not typically part of a psychopharmacology visit and, would be generally frowned upon, even if it was true. And most likely it's, not going to be the case. But with this, I feel like, I can talk about my own personal experience practicing metabolic health and the benefits of metabolic health. And I think that's very powerful.
Yes, I think so too. I think most of the physicians in general right now forget most of the time that we, as a professional part, we are an example for our patients, and it's great that you are actually doing what you're preaching, because people come to you not only for treatment but for guidance, for example, for motivation to do something more than they can. And most of the time in any specialty, especially in specialties like yourself, where you interact with people every day, it's very important to show that kind of experience that you personally did it and it worked out. And this is how the results are. And be honest and be transparent and say, hey, listen, if you want to try this, I think it's going to work for you maybe as well as it worked for me. But like you say, this metabolic part of medicine, it's very forgotten, I would say, recently. And we tend to focus more on medical pharmacological treatment more than going back to the basics and treat diseases with food.
Very true. Even the diseases of metabolism are treated with medication. Obviously the hottest medications out there are these GLP-1 agonists, which do affect metabolism, but it's really it's trying to get metabolism in a vial as opposed to metabolic health through the good old fashioned way that we were evolved to be metabolically healthy.
Yeah, that's true. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the financial aspect of what you're doing and the fact that you work your career, you're very successful in what you're doing right now. But financially, what do you see happening? Because there's a lot of talk in the medical community of having some kind of other passive income streams. Some people don't want to practice anymore. They get burned out. They want to retire. They don't necessarily have the means financially to survive that kind of change in their lives. So from your perspective, how do you see those aspects financially?
Regarding this aspect of metabolic psychiatry, how that's going to play out in the marketplace?
Yes. And also psychiatrists in general.
Yeah. Well, I mean, psychiatry in general is one of those fields that is very much affected by, I mean, really all of medicine is, but psychiatry has been sensitive to changes in reimbursement. And, I've been fortunate in my career that I haven't only worked in insurance-driven practices, and this is very common in psychiatry, actually. So, this trend of sort of concierge medicine, that sort of hit psychiatry a couple of decades ago, actually, because of the way insurance reimbursement was and the way psychiatrists were being squeezed. They were essentially being told they needed to see people for 10 or 15 minutes in order to make a living. If you had a private practice and for a medication visit, all you're getting reimbursed is, this low amount, there's no way you can do a half an hour visit and survive. You wouldn't be able to pay your overhead. So, psychiatrists had two choices. They either had to, see people in these very short visits with an insurance-driven model. And that was in many ways very unsatisfying for a lot of us because we're trained to talk to people and get to know them. And that's part of how we help them. In addition to figuring out what the right medication might be to prescribe, we're often trained to do psychotherapy, and that's a more enriching part of our day. But we weren't getting paid to do that, essentially. So one option would be just to do these short visits and stay within the insurance model, or the other model would be, and this happened quite a bit in bigger cities in Boston and New York and other bigger cities, was basically move away from the insurance model and say, we're just going to do a fee for service cash kind of model, concierge style. Pay me for my hourly for my time, essentially. So I've been lucky enough to be sort of in that model for most of my career. And not having to worry about short visits and fighting with insurance for reimbursement and all of that. And right now, this metabolic psychiatry, is, like I said, it's very new. There aren't that many psychiatrists trained in it. There are some, therapists, some dietitians for sure, and we are really in the sort of private pay world right now. I think there's some hope that we can get this into the insurance-driven world because there really is potential from a payer point of view that this could be really helpful. If a payer is looking at this and saying, we could invest a little money in improving this person's metabolism, they may not need to be on all these expensive medications year after year after year. They may be able to come off of a few of them. They may be able to lower the doses of some of the other ones. And this person's not going to need to be hospitalized over and over again. If we can really get at the root cause of what's causing trouble for this person, not only that, avoid all the medical costs that this person's incurring by being metabolically unhealthy due to their illness and their medications. I think there's a real potential there for forward-thinking insurance company to embrace this. there's a company out there that has, really embraced the ketogenic approach in diabetes. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Virta Health, VIRTA, but they're an online company that really works through an app. They take people with type 2 diabetes, and now they're also working with people with obesity and putting them on ketogenic diets. They have a coach and a dietitian sort of in the background looking at the data coming in, what they're eating and their CGM numbers, and they're seeing incredible results, reversing type 2 diabetes, getting people off all their medications, off of insulin, really high success rate doing that. And they've been able to figure out how to do it for, not a huge cost. They're now getting a lot of insurance contracts. Initially they started, I think, more in a private pay kind of model, but now that they've been able to, put it to scale and get the cost down, this is now, a very cost-effective approach for payers and companies to look at. So that's, sort of the hope in my view of what could happen in the metabolic psychiatry space is that, we're starting off here really trying to hone in and figure out how to do this well, how to do it with a variety of different people. There's a lot of research going on, multiple randomized controlled trials going on. But the future I see is that, this gets figured out to the point where we can make this much more scalable, bring it to lots of people, and make it much more affordable. But there's a lot of steps, obviously, between here and there.
Yeah, obviously. I feel like we're in such a sugar epidemic that everybody's trying to figure out a way to treat the side effects of eating sugar. And this is one of them.
Yeah. No, that's right. I mean, I think, you can try to, stay on sugar and take a lot of medications for all the illnesses that's going to cause, or, you can try to figure out how to truly get off of sugar.
Right.
And the thing that's fascinating that I find is that even people who are absolutely addicted to sugar and feel like they could never live without it, a few months on a ketogenic diet and they don't even think about sugar anymore.
Yeah.
It's the most common thing that I hear is that, oh, well, I don't even care about the thing that used to drive me crazy and, invade my mind all day. And now I don't even think about it.
Right.
Which is just incredible.
Yeah. And also I hear a lot of people saying that once you start the ketogenic diet, you can do it for a very limited amount of time because it's unsustainable. Right. And I'm thinking to myself, well, if it's that unsustainable, that means that you're still addicted to sugar because you crave that. I'm thinking, it doesn't make sense to me to feel that good, to have that kind of results and still want to go back to, something that it's totally, addictive. I would say it's probably the most addictive substance on earth right now.
Yeah. No, I think you're touching on something very important. This idea that people do complain or counter and say, oh, well, it's unsustainable. And a lot of that I think has to do with our culture. Someone, I encounter this all the time. I go down to the break room and, there's cookies and donuts and, this is how people we're so acculturated, not just, to have sugar as, fuel, but it's our reward. It's been our reward since we were little kids. It's like deeply connected to this idea that I did something good, or I deserve a reward, I deserve a treat. And, it takes a little time to disentangle that cognitive construct, I think. Even when you're metabolically healthy, there's still a little more work to do to say, that's not actually a reward. And, all these people sitting around the break room eating this, like, this is not a true reward. It seems that way. And we've all been sort of taught that and we all believe that, but you sort of eventually get to the point of seeing past that, I think. But that's the sort of last step, I think, for a lot of people. And it's a hard step for a lot of people. I understand why it's hard.
No, it's very hard. I mean, if your whole medical lounge is full of donuts and cookies and cakes, and you pass by and you want to eat something, everybody else will be like, yeah, but that's not good for you. You know that, right? So it's like psychological approach to it. You want it, but it's not good for you.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I think the thing that's also, it's even sometimes the opposite of what you said, that you get peer pressure to eat this stuff. And people look at you like there's something really wrong with you, that
right.
How could you not eat the birthday cake? Like, that's offensive.
Yes.
There's something really strange about the person who's not eating the birthday cake. And people, I think there's a lot of complicated reasons for that, but they're offended a little bit, but also threatened a little bit, and they will pressure the person to eat the birthday cake. And so even when, we know, like, let's say someone's trying to get off of alcohol, they have an alcohol problem, no one's going around to that person and saying, hey, I know you're sober now, but you really ought to have a drink with me. But that's exactly what we do around sugar.
Yeah, that's a great comparison.
Yeah.
That's true. Like, it should be treated as a disorder, and an addiction problem, like we have any other types of addictions. I want to go back to the financial aspect of being a medical professional, and look at the other side of the moon, in terms of what kind of passive income do you think we should have in medical professionals if we want to stop practicing or retire or just don't want to do it anymore?
Yeah.
Did you think about this? Do you have any plans? Do you have any experiences in your life that you build something like this?
It's a great question. I don't have as much experience with that as I probably should, but what I can say is I've been lucky enough to, be part of this new program that we started, this metabolic psychiatry program. And I do have some ownership stake in that program. So, I think that, there's a little bit of an entrepreneurial side to what I'm doing, and that, I'm both the, medical officer of that company, Accord, and the executive officer as well. So I'm really trying to grow this as a business.
Mm-hmm.
Initially we have this one residential program, but the hope is that over time we could potentially, replicate that program in other markets, or, find a way to bring it to people in an outpatient basis. So the hope is that this is just the first step of a clinical metabolic psychiatry company that would ultimately, grow. And, my hope would be that, as an owner, that I would, have some financial rewards from that.
Yeah, that probably will be very, very true. And I hope everything is going to go your way on that side. Now that you know a lot of stuff about this, if you would go back when you were young, what advice would you give to yourself?
Yeah. I would, learn about this connection between metabolism and brain health from the start. I think if I was, went back to myself in medical school, I would have said, this is what you should focus on, do the psychiatry training program, but, learn everything you can about this connection between metabolism and brain health, and, start figuring out how to, solve these clinical problems from the get-go, with that approach. I wish I was offering this to patients, a long time ago. We could have learned a lot more. Since I've been doing it, I feel like I'm learning more every month, every day, even about how to refine the approach. So I feel like, I wish I'd been doing this my whole career.
Yeah, that's true. And if you think about this, I still don't believe that even nowadays we do not have a nutrition or a clinical nutrition course even in medical school or in high school, or in any kind of form of education. We completely forget about the food as medicine.
Yeah.
And we don't teach students, we don't teach professionals this. And nowadays, for the past few years, I think there's a trend for more education in this kind of domain. But I think as medical professionals, we should push for more education in the formal school to train us that way.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, unfortunately, I see the problem as even a little deeper than that. Yes, we're not learning learning nutrition in medical school enough. But even worse is that, what would be taught would probably be quite off the mark.
Yeah.
Just, given what's going on metabolically in our country, epidemic of obesity, epidemic of diabetes, epidemic of fatty liver disease, this is all caused by people following the U.S. dietary guidelines. And so if we're basing everything off of the U.S. dietary guidelines, we're not gonna, we can learn all we want and teach that to all of our patients, but we're not going to make a big dent in what's going on. I think, the nutrition dogma needs to be challenged. And, I think that, like I said, I think, the problem's even deeper than not educating doctors is that, we're not, our guidelines coming from our federal government are not in line with science, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that they're all well overdue, because I think the whole food pyramid is based on 1970s, 1980s research.
And it wasn't even ever based on research. It was
right.
really,
Or lobbying.
on very little research. There's a lot of food company lobbying going on in the people who get together to do the dietary guidelines. That there's been documented that there's incredible amounts of conflicts of interest, and nothing's being done about that so far. So I'm hopeful, though. I mean, there's a push at this point. There's some people out there, really pushing to try to, change the process by which these U.S. dietary guidelines are going to be made in the next round. And I'm hopeful that we can come up with some more scientifically rigorous guidelines for what people are eating, because that really affects what gets served in schools and hospitals and prisons and the army. And so it's really an important part of this piece is, getting those guidelines more in line with what actually would, contribute to metabolic health and overall health.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I hope we can make some changes in that respect, although it's going to be very hard because the lobbying part is very powerful. Yeah. And there's a lot of money involved, and all the tobacco companies are now moving into the food industry, supporting this kind of, marketing practices, I would say.
Yeah.
But let's talk a little bit more about your company and what you're trying to do with it, and what are the results, and what do you expect to achieve?
Yeah. So the company is called Accord. Our website is accordmh.com, stands for Accord Mental Health. And we're a small, immersive residential program. So we only have 5 beds, and we can take a couple more additional people as day clients. And so people come in, we immerse them in this metabolic approach. So the well-formulated ketogenic diet, we have exercise, we have a personal trainer for them, we have mindfulness and mind-body practices, and circadian rhythm alignment as sort of the pillars of the program. And meanwhile, we're doing a lot of assessments. So I'm doing very extensive lab work. We have continuous glucose monitors on everyone's arm. We measure ketones every day. We have a body composition measurement. And then we're measuring mental health and functional rating scales the whole time. And the idea is that people stay for at least a month. They're going to get into ketosis. We're going to see what kind of changes that initial changes that causes. We tell them, though, that they really need to stay with this, that they're not going to get all the benefits in a month or even 2 months or 3 months, that they need to stick with this for quite a few months, maybe even quite a few years, to really feel the full benefits of this. So a big part of our program is teaching people how to do this when they get home. We have a lot of education classes about why this works and how it works, but also how to do it. We have a full-time dietitian and a chef who are doing lots of teaching of how to do the diet, and our chef is teaching people how to cook, because if you can't cook, it's going to be hard to sustain this long term. And so, cooking classes is a big part of what we're offering, actually. And so that's the idea of what we're doing. So people come in, they get that approach. We try to set them up for success for when they leave, making sure that their team and their family at home know what we're doing and why we did it and how to continue it along when they get home. And that's the idea. We are in the process of applying for an IRB so we can do some prospective research on the people who are in the program and the outcomes and results that we're getting, and hopefully find some of the correlations between which of these metabolic markers most correlate with the mental health outcomes that we're looking for. So I'm excited to have sort of a research component as well as part of it.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
So how can someone learn more about what you're doing in this kind of specific field you're in?
Yeah.
Or they can contact you?
Yeah. So happy to have people contact me. And maybe we can add my my LinkedIn address and my email address to the podcast. The other resources that I always tell people about, there's a wonderful educational resource called Metabolic Mind. They have all these YouTube videos and podcasts about metabolic and mental health correlations. They've interviewed me and many other clinicians, but also many other researchers and many of the individuals themselves who have benefited from this approach and some of the outcomes that they've had. So that's a really great resource, and there's lots and lots of videos there that people can watch. And then there's 2 books that I always recommend. One is called Brain Energy by Dr. Chris Palmer. And he's the doctor who was giving that lecture that I was describing earlier about this case that I first learned about this. And he's written this wonderful book about metabolics, and metabolism and mental health, called Brain Energy. There's another one by another psychiatrist named Dr. Georgia Ede, spelled EDE, called Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind. And she's another sort of pioneer in this metabolic psychiatry movement. And her book is also wonderful and has a lot of sort of how to actually institute this at home, recipes and guidelines about different versions of the diet. So it's very, it's very well researched, but it's also very practical. So that, those books and Metabolic Mind, I think those are really wonderful ways to learn more. Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah, I'm sure people will check them out. This is an interesting subject, and I think it's a very new and evolving science, I would say. So I congratulate you for leading a subject like this, and I hope many people will look into it and find out how they can apply those principles to themselves also. I feel like we need to check back at some point in a few months or a year to see how you're doing.
I'd love to. Yeah, this was great.
But thank you for coming over, and congratulations again for your success.
Thank you so much. It was really nice talking with you.
That's a wrap on Stellar Success, Leveling Up for Medical Pros with Dr. Tudor Francu. Interested in joining us? Go to stellarsuccesspodcast.com/guest to apply. Stay stellar and level up.